The Yom HaShoha event includes a moment when we project the names of Holocaust victims, all related to members of our two congregations. We also share the revered names of past members who survived the Shoah and have passed on in recent years. You will see projected over 500 names, combined with the 6 candles we will light, candles that commemorate the 6 million victims of the Shoah, parents, husbands, wives, brothers, sisters, children, each with a history, each with the expectation of a life which was tragically ended. This projection will take quite a while. This evening, we will also share 4 short movies. Each one shows a different aspect of the Shoah. All 4 stories have one thing in common. They all deal with survivors who eventually were rescued and safe. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, today there are approximately 195,000 survivors worldwide, the last living witnesses of the horrors of the Nazis and of those who aided them. Yimach Shemam. Each year, their number diminishes. Our duty is to give these people a voice, knowing all of them have already reached old age. It is attributed to Eisenhower that when he first saw Buchenwald, he said, "Get it all on record now. Get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the track of history, someone will get up and say, this never happened." That was in April of 1945. It is now April of 2021. Another important reason for this kind of event is to come up with live testimonies as long as possible. Worldwide, the clouds of anti-Semitism are darkening again, and the number of Holocaust survivors is diminished year by year. The truth is our only weapon in this fight. We should never let the Shoah become just another fact, losing its importance each year to be eventually washed away by the ebb tide of history. With this message, I welcome all of you and thank you for sharing this evening. I will now pass the virtual microphone to Jeremy Rosenstein, Chairman of MacDonald International Shul, for his short welcome address. Jeremy, please.
Thank you very much, Phil. On behalf of the members and friends of MacDonald Shul, I would like to welcome our friends from Young Israel and our friends from overseas and throughout the country for this evening's special Zoom program to commemorate Yom HaShoah. Listening this morning on the radio while I was driving to work to programs on the subject of the Shoah, there were interviews with second-generation family members of survivors. Nature taking place is rapidly reducing the amount of actual survivors, and it's only a matter of time until we will rely on the second and third generation to remind us what happened. It is critical that we keep the memory of the Holocaust alive. Much work has gone into this evening's program, and I would like to thank all those involved to make it a meaningful program. Thank you to all. Good health and just smachot in all our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy. It is a different approach to commemorate Yom HaShoah by Zoom. We know that the organizers have done their utmost to create the Yom HaShoah atmosphere that we experienced in past years. Projecting the names, lighting the 6 candles for the 6 million. This is the next part of this special event. The projection lasts a little more than 14 minutes, a small portion in time compared to the virtual eternity of suffering that they endured. The soft music you will hear on unobtrusive low volume is Sergei Rachmaninoff Concerto No. 2 for piano and orchestra, music to underscore the projection of the names. El Malay Rachamim, and then the siren. We have a historical recording of Kel Malay Rachamim from last year, sung very emotionally by our Chazan Rabbi Meir Lev, together with the MacDonald Shul choir. Listen.
שולחן במרומים המצי מנוחו נכונו על כנפי השכינה במהלוס קדושים וטהורים כזרקיה מאירים ומהזים מיליוני היהודים, חללי השוב אירופה, שנהרגו שנשחטו, שנשרפו ושנשרפו על קידוש השם, בידי המרצחים הגרמנים ויוזרי המשול, הוא אמין. בעבור שכל הקהל מספללים לעילוי נשמותיהם. לכן בעלו רחמים יסתירם בסתר כנפיו לעולמים. ויצרור בישראל חיים אס נשמותיהם. אדוני הוא נחלוסם. בגן עדן תהי מנוחוסם. וינוחו בשלום המשכבוסיהם ויעמדו לגורלם לקץ הימים. ונאמר
rescued and safe. This is this year's theme. We are going to present 4 different stories, each one ending up with surviving, with regaining freedom. But here are still deep wounds which will not be healed. All the stories must be made public to fight the deniers of the best ever documented historical fact, to fight ignorance of the generations to come. Let us look at the first story and think, what testimony?
This is the story of Sulla Newton Katz. The film is based on her own personal and moving account of her life during the Second World War. The producers wished to emphasize that her terrible, agonizing odyssey could not be illustrated with personal pictures. There are simply none to see. Their decision was, therefore, to use contemporaneous footage and photographs to best illustrate the brutal environment in which Sulla was forced to live over those many dreadful years. All those who hear Sulla's personal testimony cannot help but feel the intensity of her suffering at the hands of her murderous oppressors. Together with countless other inmates, Sulla endured her pain in silence, hoping and praying for a rescue that for most came too late. On a sunny morning in Nethanya, listen to the song of a true survivor. It's a happy song, and Sulla enjoys singing it. It's in Yiddish, which most people understand is not simply a language, it is a culture within itself. Yiddish embodied the Jewish way of life, Sulla's former way of life.
Jiddisch redt sich also schön, Jiddisch hat Mulechein, Jiddisch redden Tates, Sades, Weibes, Babes, Ader aber sucht auf Goyisch, sucht git Schabes. Jiddisch redt sich also gering, Jiddisch legt sich auf der Zing, was teug mir le Scheunis von allen meine Säunis. Weil Jiddisch redt sich so schön.
Yiddish embodied the Jewish way of life, Sulla's former way of life. Sulla came through an ordeal that none of us born after the Second World War can begin to comprehend. She wrote, "There is no way I can convey or describe what my fellow survivors of the Shoah and I went through. Whatever impression I give you, it was 1,000 times worse. It was very traumatic, and I couldn't speak a word of what I'd been through for more than 50 years. It was a stigma. I carried that somehow. We were different from other people. I remember after liberation, when a group of us, around 15, 16 years old, were airlifted to Manchester, we were housed in a hostel. When people came to visit us, they would look at us as though we were from another planet, as if we were a museum exhibit." Sulla's birthplace was Lodz in Poland, its second largest city in 1939. There were 600,000 inhabitants. A third of them were Jews. Sulla wrote, "I was a normal 10-year-old girl when the Germans rolled into Lodz in September 1939, just days after their invasion of Poland. The soldiers of the SS looked like strong giants to me, and they put the kind of fear inside me that it is hard for anyone, let alone a child, to imagine."
When the Germans came into Lodz, and we were standing petrified there, and the Germans, the SS, they looked gigantic. They looked, and we were, dying a slow death with fright, with fear. But not only that we were frightened. They segregated the maids straight away. They started the segregation to putting young people and old people and shaving off the religious men. They shaved the payers and they cut them. And then soon after, they burned our synagogue. We used to go to the Altstädtische Shul in Lodz. And that went up into flames, and then that's when you died a little death as well.
In February 1940, the Germans established the Lodz Ghetto and enacted their infamous resettlement laws for all the Jews of the city. By May the 1st, 160,000 Jews were hermetically sealed within the ghetto's confines. Salah remembers feeling captured and imprisoned. Barbed wire surrounded us. We lived in wretched conditions. I remember my mother making cakes from potato peel and the luxury once of a meal of horse meat. Salah lived in constant fear of being taken away. She wrote, "The Nazis would close off a street to block any means of escape, then systematically go through each of the flats, rounding up the occupants. They never left anyone behind, even the body of a dead baby. Everybody had to be accounted for." Salah Newton Katz remembered the head of the Nazi-appointed Judenrat, the Jewish council, which ran the ghetto. His name was Chaim Ramkovsky, infamous for his speech, "Give me your children," delivered at a time when the Germans demanded his compliance with the deportation of more than 20,000 Jewish children to the Helmano extermination camp. Salah recalled that he was utterly subservient to the Nazis, but he justified his actions because he felt that survival of the Jews depended on the ghetto population being as useful as possible to the Germans. To this end, Ramkovsky enacted laws that demanded that every ghetto dweller over the age of 8 must be employed in workshops manufacturing the needs of the ghetto. Shortly after, the Jewish slave population made everything from army uniforms to munitions for the German forces. Salah worked as a runner in one of the tailoring factories right until her deportation 4 years later to Auschwitz in 1944. The Song of the Ghetto reflects Salah's life, and it only came into her mind relatively recently. It speaks about Chaim Ramkovsky and how he cares about the ghetto. Instead of letting his people down, he arranges jobs for them and finds many other ways to ease this indescribable ghetto life.
Ramkovsky Chaim, geht ins Kleim, geht ins Gruppen und geht in Mann. Verzeihten all mich kein Mut nicht gegessen, mein Heim, best mein jeder eine Mann. Ramkovsky Chaim hat getracht, gearbeitet schwer, über Tag, über Nacht, gemacht a Ghetto mit a Dietto und schreit a sehr in sehr acht. Ich fuhr kein Palästina, dorten ist der Goldin Medin. Ich will kischen die Mesise, wenn die Levune scheint. Ich will sich teufeln in die Mikve jeden Tag, singe die Tikva. Ich will pflanzen Pomeranzen, es wird sein Allerheit. Ich will während unseren die Gehele, Benchnesrikischen der Twile. Ramkovsky wird doch sein, unser Freund, es wird seiner Gedille Allerheit.
Although the Lodz Ghetto's Jews were a free and productive resource for the occupying Nazi government, the Germans were divided as to whether Jews should continue to exist at all. The ghetto was killing Jews through disease and malnourishment, but not fast enough for many Germans. Almost 43,000 Jews had died in inhuman conditions since the ghetto was established until its final liquidation 4 years later. Salah Newton Katz was deported in 1944 when the ghetto was liquidated. Salah writes, "I was in one of the last groups to be deported to Auschwitz along with my mother and brother. We were transported in August, just days before my 15th birthday. I recall clearly being bundled into trucks and taken to a train station that I did not recognize. From there we were crammed into closed cattle trucks that stank of stale air and urine. After a nightmare journey lacking air, water, and food, the living crushed against the dead, they arrived at Auschwitz, the cruelest man-made hell of modern times."
You couldn't think about that. Because what you came, when I arrived in Auschwitz, what you saw, you couldn't. I'll never forget that scene. I'll never forget the bright lights and the Germans and everybody running and the segregation and the dogs and the music. And then I had a young brother who was taken from me straight away. The one that you've seen on the pictures, my older brother. And then we were on the same side. My mother and I, we were on the same side. They let us go on the same side. But they did another segregation when we got into the bath. And that's when they took her away. And me, and I'm not going to cry now. And then that's a thing you never forget. That's you can't ever forget. They never lost hope. We always lived with hope. We always, when we used to be taken out of the barracks in Auschwitz, and they used to tell us to turn around, and it was the most terrible experience because we had this Dr. Mengele who used to look over our bodies, and you got to go to the left and go to the right. But we never lost hope. The minute we sometimes we went out a whole block of women, and a few only came back. And as soon as we came back, and we hugged one another, because we were the ones who were selected to stay. Eventually, we were sent to work in Germany in an ammunition factory. I was only a young girl, but never lost hope. Never.
Salla described her arrival at Auschwitz. We were assigned to barracks and slept on concrete floors. I was fortunate to be kept at Auschwitz for only 8 weeks before being sent to work at the munitions factory at the Odern camp. It was 8 weeks of continuous selection, standing up in all weather, naked in front of Josef Mengele and his assistant, as they chose left and right, right and left. Once Mengele asked me my age, and I lied and told him I was 18. To me, every day in Auschwitz seemed like a year. The kapos supervised us. They were mainly from Slovakia and were very cruel towards us. One night they dragged me out of the barrack to pick up a large pot of coffee. I was so weak that I couldn't lift it or carry it, so instead they beat me with their leather straps. The kapos were the worst. They hit or beat us all the time for no reason. It was so unpredictable. It was a relief to be moved because it allowed you to stop thinking every second that you might be selected for the gas chambers that day. Eventually, I was selected for a work detail and was sent to Odern, a camp near Chemnitz, inside Germany. I worked there for nearly a year until April 1945. One day, without any warning, we were loaded onto a train, but this time with open trucks and without any provisions. It was a long and gruesome journey, the worst I'd ever experienced. So many people died. We travelled for about a week before finally arriving at Theresienstadt. This camp was where the Germans brought most of the Jewish transports towards the end of the war, because they'd built a large crematorium in the camp to destroy the remaining Jewish prisoners. I remember that date well. The Germans were due to cremate us on May the 10th, 1945. But it did not happen. The Russians liberated us 2 days before, on May the 8th. We stayed in Theresienstadt until August, when a British Red Cross doctor arranged for a group of us to fly to England. We were brought to the Windermere Centre, where we were taken care of, educated, and we gradually became like a family. When we arrived, we were deloused and examined by a team of doctors and psychologists, but it was a long time before I felt it was really over. Salla was one of the group known as the Boys, and she made close friendships which have continued to this day. Most of the group became lifelong friends, having lost their families. Salla then trained to become a nurse, after which she married. Her first husband was one of the boys from the Boys group. As she wrote, "For many, many years I tried to forget all about this, so my children could have a normal home life and have the education and opportunities that I missed. When my grandson, Rabbi Lando, was studying at Yavne Yeshiva, he decided to join his friends taking the trip to Poland to visit the camps. He and his group davened shacharit and laid tefillin in one of the barracks at Auschwitz-Birkenau. This act of defiance was our response to the Nazis and their aims."
Well, I don't know if People, my grandson always says, one of my grandsons, the rabbi, he always says, we are all survivors. We are all survivors. The Jewish people have all been wandering, you know.
Sulla wrote, Hitler never achieved his goal of a final solution to the Jewish problem, but the world shouldn't be allowed to forget, lest we allow such atrocities to happen over and over again. So, did Sulla ever lose her faith?
I never lost faith. I've been to schools to speak, and I always said to him, I always thought always have to say, there is Hashem, Baruch Hashem. I'm here, Baruch Hashem.
Sulla's last song is nostalgic for a world that was lost forever when the Germans invaded Poland in 1939.
Wenn ich der Mann sich von meine Kinderjugend pinkt wie a Cholim, is es mir klar. Wie seid euch du Stieberle, was hat einmal geglanzt? Sie wachs noch dus Beimerle, wo sich hab eingepflanzt. Das heißt, meg sein alt, verwachsen mit Mech und Gruß. Der alte Dach erfreut, in Fenster kein Glus nicht du. Der Garnecke Skrim verbeugen die Wand, ich wollte ihm schon sicher allein nicht erkennt. Der Garnecke Skrim verbeugen die Wand, ich wollte ihm schon sicher allein nicht erkennt. Oi, 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 Bert, mein steht alle Bert, mein Heimalle, wie ich hab meine kinderische Jahren verbracht. Wie kann ich dich vergessen, Bert, mein steht alle Bert, mein Heimalle, wie ich hab meine kinderische Jahren verbracht. Jeden Schabbes pfleg ich laufen mit alle Kinderlich gleich. Sitzen dick in grünem Felderle, kicken gleich auf dem Teich. Oi, 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 Bett, mein steht alle Bett, mein Heimalle, wie ich hab meine kinderische Jahren verbracht.
So, how does Sulla view the past and the future from the present?
Well, I'm still, I love my children, I love my family. Hashem has given me the zchut to have wonderful children and grandson and sons-in-law and grandsons and great-grandchildren. So how can I complain? And I'm here to tell the tale.
The world owes Sulla Newton Katz a debt for her personal and heartbreaking testimony. The Jewish people, the nations of the world, and all future generations must never forget what happened to Sulla and millions like her, for those who forget the past are doomed to repeat it.
The second movie, Believing in Miracles, is the essence of this story. Let us watch.
Conditions for Jews in Germany were already very precarious. So many wanted to leave, but getting an exit visa meant leaving everything behind apart from a small amount of personal property and practically no money on exit. This also entailed getting an entry visa to a country willing to take you. Anyone without wealth, distinction, special expertise, or sponsored had little chance. Immigration to Palestine was strictly measured and enforced by Britain, who were anxious to appease their Arab friends. This drastically cut the numbers of ordinary families wanting to emigrate, but never able to fill the full necessary regulations. In desperation, people started crossing the German border with Czechoslovakia illegally. This way, they didn't wait for visas and took as much with them as they could. It was dangerous, but for many, worth the risk. They had to climb the mountain range, the Erzgebirge, that divides the two countries, and slip through that way. For that, they needed a mountain guide, and this is where my father comes into the story. Maccabi had a sports hut on the mountain range to provide shelter for their members when climbing or skiing. Groups of refugees met at this hut, and my father guided them over the border. He was one of the special couriers helping at that time. He was, however, betrayed and imprisoned. On his release in early 1938, he knew he had to flee, and we made the same journey over the mountains and found ourselves in Prague, desperate for a visa to anywhere. Living in Prague was not easy. My father desperately searched for ways to get to Palestine. Financially, money was running out, and with illegal status, work was impossible. Every day, the thousands besieging every embassy increased, begging, praying, hoping for salvation in the form of a visa to anywhere. Then the impossible happened. Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia without a voice raised in disapproval. March 1939, the streets of Prague echoed to the sound of jackboots. It was obvious my father had to disappear before they came for him. He decided to flee to Poland to his unfortunate family, who had been deported from Zwickau with the Kristallnacht deportations and dumped on the Polish border. As Ostjuden, they were polluting Germany, and as refugees, the Polish population certainly didn't want them. There were thousands of them, and apart from the rampant anti-Semitism, there was no provision of food or shelter for so many. Added to this was the fear of the Nazi threat on the Polish border. So my father disappeared, and my mother was left alone in Prague with little money and two small children. She joined the endless queues every day at every embassy. The result was always the same. If she ever reached an official, they would ask the obvious questions. Did she have any special skills? No. Did she have a sponsor to vouch for her maintenance? No. What would she do with two small children in a country whose language she didn't speak? Oh, right. The deportations began. Swiftly and efficiently, streets were cleared of their Jewish inhabitants, and panic increased. Then suddenly my mother grasped at a last straw. The British Embassy decided to award 2 visas to the winners of a cookery competition. It gave anyone and everyone a chance. What could my mother lose? She cooked a traditional Friday night Shabbat meal and hoped for salvation. She won. It was now the end of August 1939. Late at night, there was a knock on our door. As a rule, it meant just one thing: deportation. There was an 8 p.m., 8 a.m. curfew, and no one was allowed out without risking death. This, however, was a woman's voice, and my mother let her in. She turned out to be a secretary from the British Embassy on a mission to save our lives. She gave my mother her British entry visa, train tickets to get through Czechoslovakia, then Holland, and the ferry to England, but had not been able to get us exit visas, giving us permission to leave Prague. We just had to take a chance and say we were visiting family if questioned. We could take no luggage that could look suspicious, only food and a few necessities. This was the first miracle. It was Sunday, September 3rd, 1939. As my foot touched the platform, it was 11 a.m., and there was a huge announcement on a loudspeaker. I, of course, did not understand what it was. The speaker was Chamberlain, telling the British people that Hitler had invaded Poland on September the 1st, and Britain had given him an ultimatum. If he did not withdraw his troops by 11 a.m. on September the 3rd, Britain would declare war. This was the case, and as a result, Britain was now at war, and the gates to freedom were closed.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
This was followed by an air raid siren being sounded, and the Jewish Refugee Committee, waiting for people like us, took us first to an air raid shelter and then to a hostel for women and children in Stamford Hill. There were a number of these hostels with separate facilities for men. The following day, my mother took a paper with my father's details and his photo, hoping to leave it in one of the men's hostels for the possibility that someone might have come across him. Knocking on the door of the first hostel, a man opened it. It was my father. He had managed to get to Poland, where he found his family in their original village, living in terrible circumstances, with little food and less money. He himself was a fugitive and had no means of helping them. He decided that the only way was for him to get to a free country and find a way of bringing them over. At the same time, he had to try and find out what was going on in Prague. He heard there was a ship sailing from the Balkans for political refugees, not necessarily Jews. As he'd been imprisoned for political activities against the Reich, he was able to get on board. There were about 1,000 men, including President Beneš of Czechoslovakia. When this ship reached the English Channel, it was too big to enter it, so apparently the men were divided into 3 groups, alphabetically. The first group would go to England, the second group to France — Hitler will never come to France — and the third group stayed on the ship and sailed to Canada. My father, Jacob Biron, was with the first group and arrived in London. It was July 1939. He now had to find a way to communicate with his wife and children and bring them to safety. The days were a nightmare. Whatever he tried was in vain. One day he heard the newspaper vendor shouting, "England in danger! England in danger!" Unable to read the paper, he asked someone to tell him what had happened. Sick with grief, he could not believe the news. The disaster was that England were in danger of losing the Ashes to the West Indies. For the uninitiated, this is cricket. We cannot imagine what his thoughts were when he tried to understand this source of anxiety. So now here we were together again, saved in a miraculous way.
The third story. The third story. Risking their lives to rescue people in danger, especially Jewish children. Yes, there were a lot of Hasidei Umot HaOlam, righteous Gentiles, known and unknown, all over. Humanity has to thank them.
It took a long time for stories like this one to become eventually public and show that Switzerland did not only turn back Jewish refugees at the border and handed them over to the Nazis, which meant their death sentence. A great deal of humanity in quietly rescuing refugees, among them a large number of Jewish children under extreme, oft life-threatening conditions, is the bottom line of this amazing story my wife Monique and I were unexpectedly confronted with during our holiday in Switzerland in 2015.
6 years ago, Monique and Jacques Korolnyk went on a discovery trip to Switzerland, to the Vallée de Joux. It's situated in the French part of Switzerland, about half an hour's drive from the city of Lausanne, close to the French border. The couple arrived in Switzerland one summer's evening in July, just as the sun was setting. It was a small village next to a lake called Le Pont. It was so beautiful there that they decided somewhat spontaneously to stay overnight and booked a room at the Hôtel de la Truite, the Hotel of the Trout. Having unpacked and freshened up, they went down to have a drink at the hotel's restaurant. Jacques continues the story. There were paper placemats on the table. We looked at them, and what we saw made us look twice. There were several pictures on the mats, and one especially drew our attention. It was a German J, short for the word Jude. It was the J that the German government stamped on their Jewish citizens' passports to readily identify them as Jews. I thought, what is this photo doing here on a table mat, in a restaurant, in the middle of Switzerland, in the middle of nowhere? The couple examined the other pictures more closely and read the text on the larger one. It read like this: Welcome, in commemoration of the Schleppers of the Riso. During the Second World War, a handful of brave, selfless local citizens smuggled many people with documents through the Riso forest. Their acts of bravery are part of the history of our region. Out of modesty or fear of negative reactions, these heroes have often remained quiet and in the shadows. The Korolnyks realized they'd stumbled by chance upon a little-known piece of history, that these table mats were produced telling the story of an area during the Second World War, the true tale of the courageous women and men who risked their own lives and those of their family to collect Jews and other people in danger across the border in German-occupied France. Acting as guides, they had smuggled men, women and children to the safety of neutral Switzerland. Monique takes up the story. We inquired at the hotel about this totally unknown and unbelievable story. They gave us a leaflet with more details and showed us the small exhibition that was on permanent display in one of the hotel's dining rooms. There were all sorts of things there, including the original climbing tools, people's personal possessions, warm clothing, etc., and skis. Why skis? Because we were told many of the rescue operations took place during the winter, when the Valais area is covered in snow and is one of the coldest regions in Switzerland, with temperatures going as low as -30 degrees. The hotel also told the Korolnyks that there was a small monument opposite the hotel on the promenade by the lake, which was erected just 7 years ago in 2014. The monument itself takes the form of a hollow hexagonal column. The same message is translated into 6 languages, one on each side of the column, in French, German, Italian, English, Japanese, and Hebrew. It says, "To the men and women of the Rousseau forests who risked their lives to aid the escape of those in the resistance, intelligence officers and Jews threatened with death in occupied France during the Second World War, 1944 to 2014, with gratitude, La Vallée de Joux." The facts were there, but they seemed to be the bare bones of the story. They could see the tip of the iceberg, but nothing below it. Jacques and Monique then started researching the detail of what happened during those terrible days of the Second World War. According to the guidebooks, the Grand Risseau forest, situated in the Vallée de Joux, remains one of the largest continuous expanses of woodland in Europe, with over 2,200 hectares of natural woodland. The Risseau presented a perfect natural border between German-occupied France and the freedom of neutral Switzerland. It offered an advantageous starting point for those wishing to flee from German tyranny, with only a small 3-foot-high dry stone wall separating the two countries. It enabled Jews, Allied service personnel and resistance fighters to enter Switzerland. That is, of course, if they could find a way to get there. In 1940, 50 local people from the Vallée de Joux joined the Swiss Information Service as part of the Swiss Intelligence Services to set up a small group of passeurs, also known as smugglers, to organize, supervise and guide the safe passage along the 200-kilometer, that's about 125 miles, of difficult forest trails. And it was not only human beings fleeing persecution who were transported across the border. Confidential documents and microfilms regarding the German army movements were also smuggled across and sent to the British intelligence services at the embassy in Lausanne. To make it more difficult for the Germans to track the smugglers, numerous different routes were formed throughout the forest, many of which can still be traced today. The Germans patrolled the French side throughout the day and throughout the night. If anyone was found within 2 kilometers of the border, they were shot on sight with no discussion. Of course, smuggling people, top-secret documents and arms supplies was a highly risky business. Many smugglers were shot by the Germans. The unlucky ones were captured alive and sent to concentration camps like Dachau for further questioning and almost certain torture and death. Local residents Anne-Marie Imhoff-Piget, who headed the smuggling group together with Victoria Cordier, worked to transport Jewish orphans from a children's refugee centre close to Toulouse in France through the Risseau to the safety of Switzerland. The Jewish children rescued through the forest were mostly orphans or children whose parents were missing, presumed killed, from Germany, Austria, Belgium and France. The Children's Department of the Swiss Red Cross agreed that the Jewish children could stay at their refugee centre, the Château de la Hille, near Parmier in Ariège. They provided them with food, shelter, clothing and other essentials. After a long and dangerous journey, the children brought just what they wore on their backs and the little they could carry. During the war, Anne-Marie joined the Red Cross. She worked in Ariège, in a centre which took in young orphans, mostly Jews. Seeing the mortal danger they were in, Anne-Marie tried to save them together with most of the staff at the centre. Despite reprimands from her official superiors in Switzerland, she continued to help save Jewish children in France and became a border crosser, playing hide-and-seek with the German patrols. Anne-Marie was lucky. She was the daughter of a forest inspector from the Vallée de Joux. This ancestry gave her a thorough knowledge of the Risseau, through which, with a few accomplices, she set up a network of people willing to help, and escape routes between occupied France and Switzerland were formed between 1942 and 1944. The journey started at the famous Château de la Hille near Toulouse in France, 700 kilometers away from the Risseau. It was a long journey. Once over the border, the guided group would rest and recover from a long, difficult journey at 1 or 2 wooden huts hidden deep in the forest. They had ironic names. Le Refuge des Sages, the Safe House of the Wise, was one, and l'Hôtel d'Italie, the Hotel of Italy. The smugglers would return to their homes before dawn if their missions went well. The escapees were rescued and safe in Switzerland. They had to continue another 10 kilometers from the border, where they could register their names and remain in internment camps for illegal foreigners, but within the safety of Switzerland. Anne-Marie, the nurse and the head of Operation Risseau, succeeded, together with her network of smugglers, to save many lives, and mainly the lives of Jewish children. After the war, and despite their selfless bravery, more than 100 Swiss wartime smugglers were accused, fined or imprisoned by the Swiss authorities for charging money and profiteering from smuggling contraband during the war. The smugglers had of course admitted to carrying contraband, such as chocolates and cigarettes, when stopped by the German army to keep them off the trail of their real cargo. The Germans gave the smugglers fines and therefore not a death sentence. But it took until 2009 to put the record straight. Many of those who were involved in the smuggling network were then decorated as heroes of the Second World War. Here are just 4 of them. Anne-Marie Imhoff-Pigeouet, the organizing brain of the rescue team who helped mainly Jewish children cross the French-Swiss border, thus saving them from certain death. She was awarded the Medal of the Righteous from Yad Vashem in Jerusalem in 1992. Fred Raymond was a watchmaker and a spy, and a great sportsman too. His mission was to observe the occupied French departments on the other side of the Riceau, and he was leader of the Swiss Connection. Madeleine Cordier was a deeply religious woman who followed her whole family into working with the resistance. She specialized in making forged passports, and together with her younger sister, she managed to help many people escape. Finally, Victoria Cordier. She was the youngest sister of the Cordiers, a resolute and intrepid young woman who was induced into the resistance in Lyon with the responsibility of liaising with the Swiss Connection. And so, thanks to a spontaneous stay in a Swiss hotel by Monique and Jacques Korolnyk, we now know another chapter of how good people at huge personal risk helped Jews during those dark days of the Shoah. We end this story with a message in 6 languages taken from the official commemorative video of the heroic events in the forest of Riceau.
Aux passeurs de la forêt du Rizou qui ont risqué leur vie pour aider à se réfugier en Suisse des résistants, des agents de renseignement et des juifs menacés de mort en France occupée pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. 1944-2014, la vallée de Joux reconnaissante.
Den Frauen und Männern, die während des Zweiten Weltkrieges unter Einsatz ihres Lebens jüdischen Flüchtlingen, Mitglieder der Resistance und der Nachrichtendienstes, denen in Frankreich der Tod drohte, die Flucht durch den Rizou ermöglichten. 1944 bis 2014, das Vallée de Joux ist dankbar.
To the men and women of the Rizou forest who risked their lives to aid in their escape, those of the resistance, intelligence officers, and Jews threatened with death in occupied France during the Second World War, 1944-2014. With gratitude, la Vallée de Joux.
לזכר מבריחי הגבול ביער ריזו שסיכנו את חייהם כדי לתת מחסה בשוויץ למתנגדים, לסוכני מודיעין וליהודים שהיו תחת איומי מוות בצרפת הכבושה במהלך מלחמת העולם השנייה 1944 עד 2014. Vallée de Joux assir toda.
A coloro che a rischio della propria vita aiutarono resistenti, agenti dei servizi segreti ed ebrei minacciati di morte nella Francia occupata dai tedeschi durante la Seconda Guerra Mondiale a passare la frontiera nel bosco del Rizou, affinché essi si potessero rifugiare in Svizzera. 1944-2014, la Valle di Joux riconoscente.
在第2次世界大战期间，有一群男人和妇女，他们曾经冒着生命危险，帮助那些被追杀的抗战人士、情报员和犹太人，从当时被德军占领的法国穿越黑如森林边境到瑞士避难。1944年、2014年。致以崇高敬意 La Vallée de Joux.
A 4th and final story brings us to the harbor of lost hope, the springboard to freedom.
Very little has been said about the refugees, the Jewish refugees that came through Portugal, mainly in 1941-42. Actually, they started coming to Portugal already in 1933, mainly from Germany. My father at the time, he was invited, an Ashkenazi rabbi, young rabbi, 28 or 29 years old, to come to Lisbon. So he was a man that spoke a few languages. So of course, when the refugees started coming, he found mainly a Portuguese community, and my father played a very central action. He was very central because he spoke all these languages. And of course, many people looked for some psychological and religious comfort with the rabbi. So everybody was knocking his door in his office, asking, you received the list, you know the list from the Joint Distribution Committee, from Caritas, which was part of the church. And my father was very close to the Cardinal of Portugal at the time, Cardinal Cerejeira, which actually means Kirschbaum. So my father said, well, Kirschbaum is a Jewish name, Cardinal. So he answered, we are all cousins, Rabbi. No news about that. So he had a very, very good contact, and he was really an extraordinary man. And I've been studying a little bit the history of those days, and many people mention him as a very, very special man that really helped in finding mainly children that were hidden in convents, in Catholic schools, in Catholic homes. And somehow, much has been spoken about the church in those days, but the church had a lot of lists and information about where Jewish people were hiding. So he gave most of these lists to my father, and that was very, very important, because that helped, find a direction in France, in Spain, in where are they, how many children. At the time, Joint Distribution Committee and HIAS, mainly these two institutions, were not authorized to establish themselves in Spain, which was a neutral country. So they asked Portugal to authorize them to work in Spain, in Portugal. And the government authorized them to come. So Portugal was mainly the center of the Joint Distribution Committee at the time in Europe, the Jewish Agency for Palestine. They came late. They said themselves that they were late in coming into the project from Israel at the time, 1941-42. But they were very interested in the emigration of these refugees into Israel, into Palestine as well. The confusion was so big that in my house, in my parents' house, Moshe Sharet comes in, the first foreign minister of Israel, comes to Portugal and meets at our home. He and another very famous general in Israel, David Shaltiel, who was very much responsible for the fight in Jerusalem in 1948, a very, very, very big character in the scenario of Israel at the time. So David Shaltiel and Moshe Sharet come and have meeting at our home how to resolve this passage of the Jews. So many people had already visas for United States, for South America. And I must say that although very much has been written about it, it was not easy, because all these countries established a clausus number, numerus clausus. So there were no, for instance, Brazil and Argentina had very, very serious numerus clausus to accept Jews. So again, with Portuguese, the rabbi had to have contacts a little bit with the consuls or the ambassadors of this country, and go with the refugees and sit with them and explain the situation when they wanted to receive. But since he was the rabbi, you know, he was on an official position, this sort of consuls of these countries did not want to establish a conflict, an open conflict, you know, which somehow, you know, did put these countries in a bad. But we must say, you know, that, so they found, for instance, Cuba at the time that wanted to, yes, bring in the Jews. And there were some other countries in South America, and Canada was very willing. But the big objective of the refugees was United States, and United States was very, very difficult.
Sou fotógrafo e sempre adorei mexer nas fotos da minha família. A minha família, originalmente, ela veio da Galícia, o que hoje em dia é a Ucrânia. Eles passaram alguns anos em Portugal, justamente durante a Segunda Guerra Mundial. Em 1954, eles se mudaram para o Brasil. Eu sou brasileiro, nasci no Brasil. Somente escutei as histórias sobre a guerra, o Holocausto, histórias da minha família, histórias de outras famílias que tentavam fugir para a América do Norte, para a América do Sul, via Portugal. O meu avô já era rabino em Portugal. O meu pai sempre falou muito do período que eles passaram em Lisboa e de como o povo português ajudou a salvar diversas famílias, não só de judeus, como de intelectuais, artistas e outros perseguidos pelo regime nazista.
No período do Holocausto, que vai de 1933 a 1945, Portugal se tornou um centro importante em termos judaicos e certamente em relação aos refugiados judeus.
Numa guerra onde morreram 6 milhões de judeus, dentro de um total de quase 50 milhões de civis, o papel que Portugal teve foi muito importante, talvez a única rota de fuga que sobrou na Europa. E essa abertura que Portugal tinha na época é praticamente desconhecida do grande público. Foi pensando nisso que resolvi ir com meu pai até Lisboa, para ele reencontrar antigos conhecidos, pessoas que pudessem nos ajudar a contar como foi esse período tão importante na diáspora judaica.
A comunidade portuguesa, pequena como era, foi extremamente receptiva. Acho que, sem desmerecer qualquer pessoa que eu me lembre, as casas estavam abertas para os refugiados que chegavam, eventualmente, sem condições de pagar hotéis ou qualquer outro lugar de alojamento. E essa inserção foi uma inserção totalmente espontânea, livre e de boa vontade.
Na verdade, Portugal não era um país de exílio, as pessoas não podiam ficar cá, a não ser algumas que acabaram por ficar, pronto, que arranjaram a maneira de ficar, mas a política governamental naquela época era país de trânsito, era como alguns chamaram uma sala de espera.
E conheci ainda imensa gente que tinha recebido refugiados em casa, que os pais tinham trabalhado na recepção aos refugiados, no apoio.
Tinha muita gente entrando e saindo. Pessoas que nós nem sabíamos de onde vinham, nem quem eram, mas vinham tomar banho, vinham comer, vinham descansar, vinham dormir, vinham falar com a minha mãe, vinham pedir conselho. Enfim, era uma verdadeira estação de trem.
We crossed the Pyrenees Mountains by foot, on foot. They got us to Spain, to Barcelona, until they were able to put us on a train that took us to Lisbon. And I gather that this is the picture of our arrival to Lisbon.
Ali eles levavam uma vida normal e volta e meia vinha o rabino Mendel de Zendruck de Lisboa, se encontravam com eles, lhe davam um apoio moral, certamente passava também o Shabat.
Portugal não gastou um tostão com os refugiados aqui. Foram os judeus americanos, nomeadamente, que financiaram. Agora, a nossa comunidade teve um papel muito importante e muitas vezes não se fala nesse papel.
O apoio que era preciso dar aos judeus era um apoio solidário das famílias, não eram só das instituições. E então eu vivi esse ambiente de pessoas expulsas das suas terras que procuravam um mundo melhor.
Mas por várias razões também históricas não se sentia o antissemitismo em Portugal e muito menos o antissemitismo racial, tal como ele era sentido na Alemanha nazi. Só para dar um exemplo, um judeu português era primeiro um português. Depois tinha uma religião minoritária num país onde a religião maioritária era o catolicismo.
Aquilo que nós vemos hoje aconteceu há 80 anos. As pessoas têm medo do outro, têm medo daqueles que vêm de fora, têm medo de outras culturas, de outras pessoas que eles não conhecem, da instabilidade que podem provocar, da concorrência aos empregos.
O que me impressiona é que a história está se repetindo. Talvez sem guerras declaradas, ondas de refugiados estão de novo cruzando o mundo para escapar de ódio e de miséria. E assustador é ver manifestações antissemitas voltarem a acontecer nos dias de hoje.
Let us thank the team which set up these 4 movies. They've done a superb job with both technique and content. And now, Ani Ma'amin, I believe, performed by Rabbi Chazan Meir Lev, accompanied by Menashe Shibulka.
Ani Ma'amin באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח אני מאמין, אני מאמין באמונה שלמה בביאת המשיח אני מאמין, ואף על פי שיתממע עם כל זה אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא, בכל יום שיבוא, ואף על פי שיתממע עם כל זה אחכה לו בכל יום שיבוא, בכל יום שיבוא.
We shall now close the video portion of the event with a historic recording of Hatikva as sung by the inmates of Bergen-Belsen on the first Erev Shabbos of their liberation.
Amen.
Israel Chai, the children of Israel still liveth.
The closing and thank you address will be given by Graham Nussbaum of Young Israel. Graham, please.
On Yom HaShoha, one's emotions run riot. How could a so-called civilized nation have carried out such a heinous crime against the Jewish people? How could the world turn its back on the Jews, condemning them to near certain death? How could countries where Jews had lived for centuries become partners in the so-called final solution? The survivor's testimony that I heard some time ago etched in my mind the following. She said that of all the horrendous cruelty she endured, the one that hurt her the most was when a close childhood non-Jewish friend brought the Nazis to her home. The ultimate betrayal. Following these painful emotions comes the uplifting emotion of gratitude that we have and live in the state of Israel. Yes, we argue a lot with each other, especially our politicians, but when it really, really matters, we will absolutely certainly protect each other without a doubt. Such a comforting reality. On behalf of us all, I'd like to thank Salah and Ruth for sharing their traumatic experiences during the Shoah with us. Salah, no one's ever going to forget your singing. It was unbelievable. Opening up like that must have been extremely difficult for you both. Thank you, Monique, Jacques, and Elchanan, for your amazing stories of rescue. And thank you to those who put together this excellent, thought-provoking, emotional reminder for Yom HaShoah, a day on which we have an obligation to remember.
Thank you, Graham. This ends our year's Yom Shoah Zoom event. Thank you for watching, and thank you for spreading the word about these unbelievable stories you have just heard. Another important announcement, tomorrow at 9:45 a.m., the Henry Kur Judaical Library will organize the traditional Holocaust lecture this year on the topic of the Bolivian Schindler, this time on Zoom. Leslie Port and I will give the lecture. You can find all the Zoom details on the Yom HaShoah program, on the mails you've received, and on the websites of both shuls. All of the videos will be available on our website. Goodbye and good night.